All right, everyone, we are now live on Facebook, live here on Zoom. Welcome, everybody who's tuning in tonight. We are so excited to be bringing you, oh, actually, we're not live on Facebook. Something just glitched. Excuse the glitch. Okay, we're back. Welcome again if you're just joining us. So welcome, everybody. We are so excited to have a little Whiskey Wednesday going on tonight, where we're going to talk about the special release of the Thomas S. Moore bottles that just came here to New Hampshire. So Mark Roy, our spirits marketing specialist, is on the line tonight. Mark was responsible for picking out some of these bottles. We have Danny, the master distiller. And then from his team, we also have Chris Collins on with us tonight. So we're very excited to have these three guys here tonight to talk a little bit about the Thomas S. Moore collection. This has been in the works for some time. I won't tell you when Mark picked these because I don't quite remember, but we've been talking about getting these in store for a while. They all launched on April 15th. They're available at so many of our stores, and these are really, really high quality products. Some people thought that they'd only be available at our bigger spirit specialty stores, but we've got them everywhere. So we're really excited about this promotion, well, sort of promotion, because it's partially celebrating our birthday. We're going to be having special Thomas S. Moore bottles every year in honor of our birthday, which is over the summer. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Danny, and I will be here monitoring questions. So leave any questions you have, and I will share them with Danny as we go on.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciate it. And thank you to the New Hampshire Liquor Commission, because this is really fun and exciting. And I think that this project is special. And Mark, you did a fantastic job of picking the barrels you picked. I forget how many samples we sent you, but these are good ones. So I guess I'll sort of map out a couple things. But an introduction. So I am Danny Kahn. I'm the master distiller at the Barton 1792 distillery. I've been here for 3 years. My background is mostly in beer. I spent many, many years on the technical side of making beer. And as I like to say, beer is, well, let's just say the nice one. Beer wants to be bourbon when it grows up. There's another way I say that sometimes, but we'll leave it nice. Beer wants to be bourbon when it grows up. And I've spent a lot of time making alcoholic beverages. And it's, again, a treat to be here. So one thing that I think works really well is please direct your questions through the chat. And I find that the best possible way to get engagement and to make sure that I am answering what might be of interest to you. I will tell you that this is not my day job. I do not do this for a living. I actually run the distillery. And just a little bit about that. That means that I'm responsible for the grains that come in, where we store them, and just a little bit about the bourbon process, how we mill those grains and we mix them with water to create a mash or a cook. And that is where we convert starch into sugar, because sugar is what the yeast need to produce flavors and alcohol. So after we cook or mash the grain, we deliver that mash to a fermenter. We add yeast. The yeast turn the sugars into alcohol, which we need very much, carbon dioxide, which we don't need, and a whole bunch of flavor compounds that are really quite small, but they drive flavor in the bourbon. And then after that, we put it through the still, and then we cut it and we put it into barrels. And these things that I'm talking about, the other reason why I like to mention them is that they speak to the levers that I get to pull in order to create flavor. So how we do all those processes actually impact flavor. And that's a very important point of what I want to talk about when we talk about the Thomas S. Moore. So then again, once we run the beer, the distiller's beer through the still, we have distillate. We cut it down to typically 125 proof and put it into barrels. And where it is aged and how long it is aged drives a lot of the flavors. So, how the barrels were made, where the wood came from, how long the staves were seasoned or air dried before we actually made the barrels, how the barrel was charred. And then once we put bourbon in the barrels, are they in a high floor of the rick house where we store barrels, where it is tends to be hotter and drier. And that's when we get more evaporation, more angel share is lost. And that's when the product goes into the wood and back out of the wood. So it's that exchange as a function of temperature and humidity that really drives how the bourbon ages. So that's you know, a really, really high level sort of a primer, I guess, on bourbon. And that's a big part of the flavor. We're going to talk about that. But Thomas S. More, I guess what I'd like to cover very briefly next is who was Thomas S. More and why did we name this bourbon after him? Well, Thomas S. More was born in Kentucky in 1853. And before our distillery was known as the Thomas S. More Distillery, he partnered with a person named Mattingly. So it was the Mattingly and More Distillery. And that started up in 1876. Then it was in 1889 that Thomas parted ways with Mr. Mattingly and started up his own distillery called the Thomas S. More Distillery. Now, what's interesting is that on our distillery property today, which is located in Bardstown, Kentucky, there's a road that goes through essentially the center of our distillery. And on one side is our bottle shop. And that is the location of where the Mattingly and More Distillery was located. And water came from what was called the Morton Spring. And that Morton Spring is still very active. We still get a lot of water out of it. And then on the other side of the road, where the distillery is today, that's exactly where Thomas More built his Thomas S. More Distillery in 1889. Now, we also have a spring on that side of the property. We have since named it the Thomas S. More Spring, but it still flows and it still provides the water for an awful lot of our production. So that exists today. And what's really interesting is that there's a building, which used to be where we built barrels, and there's a portion of the distillery that is original to the construction in 1889. So we have that history going for us, and it is still in place. So Thomas S. More was a real person, and he had a real distillery, and it's really part of our roots. So we felt that it was a great opportunity to bring out this new bourbon. Thomas S. More was really quite the legend in the bourbon world, and he was considered to be an innovator. So we like to speak about Thomas S. More as being an innovative product. You know, it's a great bourbon that we put in various barrels for extended periods of time. So there is a connection there. He was an innovator, and we have taken this. We have taken this. Forward. And I just saw a comment come across, which is kind of interesting and timely. It was something about his grandkids. Well, no, true story, but last week I met two of Thomas S. More's great grandkids, and one of his, at least one, it might have been two of his great grandkids, but they are in Kentucky and they were touring the distillery. And I got to share what we're doing with him, and that was a really interesting connection. They were super nice and wonderful people, and they appreciated what we were talking about and what we were doing. So that was kind of fun. So I actually got to meet his grandkids, great grandkids and great granddaughter, at least that. So that was pretty fun, and that was kind of cool. So last thing I want to talk about with Thomas S. More, because it's on the bottle. But there's a sort of an interesting illustration of a horse, and that was the Belle of Nelson County. And the Belle of Nelson County was a thoroughbred who had won the Kentucky Oaks, and several of the brands back when the Thomas S. More Distillery was in service, I think, branded that horse. And we have carried that forward, and it is on our bottles as well. So there's a very, very high level introduction as to who Thomas S. More was. And I guess what I would like to do, and please, Caroline, whenever there are questions, feel free to jump in And, if it's relevant to what we're talking about, I'm more than happy to answer them as we go.
Awesome. We do have a lot of people tuning in on Facebook tonight. So for the currently 68 of you watching on Facebook, please leave your questions in the comments. I'm monitoring on my phone. Don't worry.
All right, great. So, again, like I said, speaking to the public is not my day job. I actually run the distillery and make the decisions about production and flavor and shutdowns and all that stuff. So I guess what that has me do when I talk about bourbon, I like to talk about the levers that we get to pull to create flavor. And I think that for everybody out here is most definitely a bourbon fan or wants to learn about bourbon. So I like to talk about some of the levers that we get to pull to create flavor. So I'm gonna, again, I did that very high level summary of the distilling process, and all of those areas create flavor. But I want to talk about this to start in terms of what it means to be a cask finished bourbon. Okay. Before I do that, because there's a lot of people, I'm not going to ask the question. I'm going to ask the question. I'm not going to wait for answers. There are 5 things that are required by law to be bourbon, and I really like people to understand these. A lot of people get them mostly right, but I don't think anyone has ever gotten it 100% correct. So there are 5 things that are required to be bourbon. It has to be made in the United States of America. We like to think it has to be made in Kentucky, but by law, it can be made anywhere in the United States. I think what I like to say is that you can make bourbon anywhere in the US, but if you want to sell it, you got to make it in Kentucky. So that's kind of where I land. Number 2, it has to be 51% or more corn. That's required. Number 3, and this is the one that everyone gets a little bit wrong, it has to be stored in new charred oak containers. A lot of people say white oak barrels, but it doesn't have to be white oak, and it doesn't have to be a barrel. It can be a wooden box that has been charred. The problem is it's really hard to move boxes around. So we make barrels so that they can roll in and out of the warehouses, and it just makes it really easy to handle. So new charred oak containers, it could be white oak, it could be red oak. The problem is red oak tastes really bad, and it's also very porous. So I don't think there's any reason to use red oak. It's really bad. It's got to be distilled to no more than 160 proof. And that's really important because, for example, vodka has to be distilled to 190 proof or greater. And by distilling it that hard, you actually remove a lot of flavor. So we actually don't come off of the still any higher than 135 proof, and that enables us to retain a lot of the complexity that makes the bourbon complex down the road. So again, it has to be distilled no more than 160 proof, and it's got to be put away in a barrel at no more than 125 proof. So that's the background on what bourbon is. So when we made the Thomas S. More bourbon, and one of the things that it says on the label that is not just sort of marketing fluff, it says extended cask finish. And that is a really, really important point, because often cask finished bourbons might go into a barrel for 2 months to 4 months, and they might be absolutely wonderful. And what happens when you have a barrel and a cask for just a shorter period of time, what you're doing is you're able to extract the flavor that was in that cask into your bourbon. So that is certainly something that we do. But then with the extended finish, there's 2 other things that happen that are quite unique. One is that by storing it in the barrel a long time, and by the way, these sherries were I'm not exactly sure about the specific 5 that made this single barrel, but our sherries as a whole were anywhere from 2 to 4 years in the secondary cask. So by storing it that long, what you're also getting is the extraction of the oak flavors that were in that sherry barrel. So, sherry barrels, wine barrels are treated very differently. Rather than being charred, they typically do what's called a toast. And a char is where you give it direct flame and you actually burn it, and it actually turns that layer of wood into charcoal. And that's where you get the color and a lot of the flavor of the bourbon. But when you toast a barrel, you don't get nearly as much color, and you get very different flavors. You get, subtler flavors, not as caramelly, not as roasted. You get a little more toasted character. That sort of sounds silly, because that's what we're doing. We're toasting the barrels, but you get some subtle baking spices. If people out here are wine fans, the oak character that you get from a glass of wine that's been in oak is a toasted oak. So it's very, very different than the char. So by storing the barrel for a couple of years, you start to extract some of those flavors. And also what's important is, some of those barrels have been filled and emptied and filled and emptied. And each time you do that in the wine world or the sherry world, you extract some more tannins. So if we put the bourbon into a sherry barrel after one fill and empty, you're going to get more tannins than if you had it after it was filled and emptied a couple times. So you get softer flavors and you get different types of flavors. And that became very apparent when I tasted all of these barrels and just, rated or ranked their flavors. So again, you get the regular extraction of flavors that was in the barrel. You get the different oak flavors that were in that secondary cask. And then also, just by storing this finished bourbon in that barrel for a longer period of time, you're getting more of that normal barrel aging character. And so to explain that, and I held this off a little bit, the bourbon that we put in this secondary cask to start with was 5 to 6 years old. And I find that to be the ideal spot. I think most people like bourbons that are a little bit older. Personally, if it's a high rye bourbon, I prefer 10 years, 10 to 12 years is a sweet spot. Any older than that, it's too much oak. But by having a bourbon that is between 5 and 6 years old, it hasn't fully extracted all of the caramel and oak flavors that are in the primary barrel. So instead, you get some of the fermentation character. You get some of the grain bill. You can pick up more of the rye notes and more of the corn notes because it hasn't aged so long. And I find that those flavors they work better with the secondary cask than if we just had a really old bourbon that was loaded with oak and caramel and cinnamon and nutmeg and all those barrel spices. So I find that a younger bourbon works better into these barrels. But anyways, by holding this bourbon in the secondary cask longer, you're getting some of the normal aging. And what happens is, as the bourbon evaporates out of the barrel, you lose volume. So you lose water, you lose alcohol. And then as that goes away, it's replaced with oxygen. And oxygen reacts with the flavors in the barrel. And that's where you get some of the really wonderful, fruity, complex stone fruits, cherries, dried apricots, dried grapes, raisins. And that's where some of those really spectacular flavors come from. And those are the flavors that I appreciate most from a bourbon. So there's a lot there. And those are some of the primary flavors that we're dealing with. And we haven't even talked about the sherry yet. Any thoughts out there?
Yeah, Danny, we have a couple of questions from Facebook. So you had mentioned at the beginning of tonight's event that you've been with Thomas S. More for about 3 years. And one of our viewers on Facebook is curious, have you ever had a chance to come up to New Hampshire for the Distiller Showcase since you've been with Thomas S. More?
I have not. And our distillery, by the way, is Barton 1792 Distillery now. So it's no longer called the Thomas S. More Distillery, just a point of note. I have not. I actually spent a lot of time in New Hampshire, in Merrimack, New Hampshire. One of the breweries I worked at has a little brewery there. We thought it was a little brewery then, but it's pretty darn big. But I spent a lot of time in Merrimack, New Hampshire, and sounds like a great event, but unfortunately I have not been up there for that particular event.
All right, Mark, I think we've got to add him to the guest list next time we're able to have it.
I can't even begin to tell you how anxious I am to travel again. I think at one point I was traveling too much, but now I will be actually on a plane for the first time in 15 months in about 2 weeks. So I would be more than happy to come to the East Coast,
Nice.
preferably not in January or February.
No. Let's see, another question from Facebook. Stephen would like to know, how many mash bills are there for Thomas S. More?
So far, so far everything that's been released has been one mash bill, and I have another rye in a barrel that I'm fooling around with. But right now it is one mash bill, and that mash bill is our standard 1792 mash bill, which is it's a high rye bourbon. And that just means that, some bourbons have very, very low rye, so you don't get the spicy and the nutty and the peppery and the floral notes that rye provide. You get more of the corn and more of a softer mouthfeel. And I find that our high rye bourbon is actually a really nice complement to the wine or other spirits that we're aging this bourbon in. So again, to answer your question, no, it's right now just one grain bill, but there are options, and this is one of the fun things. We get to play and experiment. And I'll share a little bit with this group that we've got a lot of different barrels with spirit in them, and some are probably going to be really good, and some might not be as good. But this Friday we get to experiment and taste probably about 15 or so different barrel types that have been aging bourbon. So we'll get some ideas as to what we might want to do next.
That is a perfect segue, because somebody else on Facebook is curious, how do you decide which type of barrels to do the final finish in?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things we can do, and that is, if we're familiar with the products, we can kind of predict in our heads, this flavor might go really well with bourbon. So we start with an idea. One can also, for example, if you were to take sherry and just put it into a bourbon, you get some idea what's going to happen. But remember what I said, that sort of represents most cask finished bourbons, where they only store in the barrel for a few months. So what you're getting is the flavor out of the barrel that whatever was in that barrel ahead of time. So by putting a couple drops into a bourbon, you're not going to learn about the extended age, or you're not going to learn about what flavors you're going to pick up from that other cask. So it gives you some ideas, but not all ideas. And then sometimes you just have to do it. And, you don't know if it's a success until you try. I'm experimenting with tawny port barrels, and I think that it's absolutely incredible. Tawny port's an older port. There's just more raisin and nutty characters. And I think it's going to be one of my favorites. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. We're also experimenting with various rums, and rum and bourbon actually go really well together in my mind. And a bunch of different wines, and as I've said, this is no guarantee that these will ever be released, but we've got some other stuff out there too. So we'll find out. I'm not trying to be specifically elusive on this topic, but sometimes you just don't know, and they may not be good at 6 months, a year, 2 years, and then in 5 years they may be incredible. So if we have stuff that's just not great, we'll probably keep it in the barrel and see what happens.
Well, we have Tracy here on Zoom tonight, and she just commented that she loves tawny port. So if that one makes the cut, make sure you send some to us here in New Hampshire.
Well, and as I think I said at the beginning, or at least to some people before we started, the fact that you all are doing this is really quite special, because this is the first time we've done single barrels. Now, one thing that single barrels of the Thomas S. More. Now, one thing that, people think this is like the best thing ever, but I will explain. The first, we other than the sherry casks, our first release of Thomas S. More were three different expressions. They were Chardonnay, they were port, ruby port, and they were Cabernet. And there were a total of 1,100 barrels, of all three of those expressions. And I did not have anything to do with the barrel selection. And moving forward, I am selecting the barrels, and we've got a really good handle on how we want to do it. But in order to make sure we got the right blend, no joke, I tasted 1,100 barrels 3 times. It was over 350 hours of setup and tasting. And of course, you can only do that in very small increments. And I wouldn't exactly say it was fun, because that's a lot of work. And what I am very pleased about, though, is I then put them into categories. These are the barrels that are really fruity, or maybe really oaky, or maybe they're a little bit buttery. But then there were some barrels that I just thought were not appropriate. They were maybe too coarse or a little too astringent. So those were separated, and I put the barrels into categories, like all of these that were fruity got blended together, and all of these that were oaky got blended, and all of these that were toasted or whatever got blended. And then I used those sub blends to create the final blend. And that's kind of how it came to be. And it was a fun exercise. I'm very happy overall with the results. So that was a good exercise. Single barrels is very different. Single barrels, you just taste the barrel and you pick the one you like. And these are spectacular. So I did see one note come across. Somebody said they had, I think it was the number 5.
Yes, that I saw that too. That's Terry here on Zoom. Hi, Terry.
Hi, Terry. So everybody, I guess, does not necessarily have samples in front of them, which is unfortunate. I feel like a bad person if I'm going to be tasting in front of everybody. But I do happen to have samples of all the 5 barrels. And I'm tasting number 5. So to me, it really explodes with the flavors, with the aromas. And by the way, when I taste, a couple things I like to note. I always like to look at the color. I think that's a big indicator of what's going on. And when I look at all 5 of these together, there are very, very clearly different hues and intensities of color. Normally, with a bourbon that's going to be about 5 or 6 years old, they're all going to be about the same color, but color is an impression of what the flavor might be like, because first of all of the color comes from I was going to say the primary barrel. That's not true. All of the color comes from the barrels that they were stored in, from the char mostly. And then, some of the residual sherry has color, and then how the barrels were toasted. So the color comes from the barrel. But then I really like to take in the aroma and learn about what it is. And I'll sniff it 7, 8, 10, 15 times for every taste. This one's very pronounced sherry, which is nutty. That's one of the characters I like most out of sherry. Some dried fruit, some stone fruits, which to me are, I lump peaches and apricots, plums sort of together. Sometimes I'll pick up specific fruits, but it's toasted oak, it's caramel, it's nutty. There's a lot going on. It's just got an incredible aroma. A lot of flavor. It's got a really, really full flavor. So when I judge a bourbon, I'll judge the aroma, I'll judge the flavor, and then I judge the finish. How long does it stick around on the tongue, and what flavors sort of linger in the background? So those are the things that I'm looking for. And this one is really nice. Mark, you picked a great one here for sure. They're all great, but it's got just incredible, the aroma is just complex, and I get something a little different each time. Excuse me. Sweet and full, and It's got a nice toasted oak finish. So it's a really nice one. I hope that those who have it enjoy it. It's really quite special.
Looks like we have Tim on Zoom also tasting from number 5. That seems to be a popular one with you guys who are on the line tonight. So that's exciting. Mark, would you be able to tell our viewers about how you chose these barrels?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. I believe, don't quote me, but Danny mentioned earlier, I think it was 15 samples that we got sent up. And I went through the 15 samples, and I often get to ask this question on how I go about selecting single barrels for our consumers in New Hampshire. If it's 1 or 2 barrels, it's more difficult, believe it or not, because I've been around a long time and I'm kind of selfish with my palate. So if I'm picking 1 or 2 barrels, I kind of look for stuff that I like, that kind of hits all parts of it, as Danny was just tasting through. You know, I like a big kind of thick mouthfeel on the front, and then some good flavors through the middle. And I kind of like a lingering, little bit spicy, oaky on the finish. But where you select more barrels, as Danny alluded to earlier, when he goes through samplings, you know, I'll sample 15 samples and I'll put 2 that are similar together. I'll try to pick some that I call like entry level. They're kind of a lighter style. So if somebody's just getting into the bourbon whiskey category, it's something that's not really going to be hot and spicy and bold and oaky on their tongue or on their palate. So kind of something entry level. And then I try to select some that are middle of the road that I talked about earlier. I kind of put myself in the middle of the road. And then on the far end, I try to pick some that for the guys that like a long cigar, you know, a 2-hour cigar, and sit by a fire and have a couple fingers, either clean, either neat, or over 1 ice cube, and kind of sip it after dinner or an evening nightcap. So, you know, with the millions of customers we have, thankfully, that come into our stores and shop in New Hampshire, I try to hit a range that everybody can enjoy. And I also would encourage people to pick up 1 or 2 bottles, or 2 or 3 bottles, and actually sample them side by side, because a lot of people don't realize the nuances and the flavor differences between these single barrels unless you're actually tasting them side by side. Some of them are drastic enough that you could tell if you did it a few days apart. But if you do them side by side, it's really eye-opening, and it really kind of broadens your spectrum and your flavors that you get out of your bourbon. So it's been a great process. It was an incredible partnership with Danny and Chris and the guys down at 1792 and the Sazerac family. And we look forward to continuing this for the next 4 years with our anniversary birthdays every year leading up to our 90th. So I hope you enjoy these. I'm looking forward to our fall selections.
Hey, Mark, I forgot what you had said when we tasted these before, but and you know, the one I like the best today may be different than what I like best tomorrow. You know, and that's the beauty, because you may want to try, you know, different flavors. But right now, I'm loving 2. What did you what were your thoughts on number 2? I just find it to be an explosion of aroma and complexity, and a lot of flavor.
Yeah, it's got a very good nose on it. Definitely get the little sweetness, little caramel on the nose.
It's more oaky than number 5 for sure.
See, that has a little bit of a thinner mouthfeel for me, but it definitely has that oak on the end. And I thought number 5 was a little bit thicker on the palate for me, but this number 2 that we had talked about earlier, I get a little hint of some citrus notes up front. It's a little bit thinner with a little bit of citrus, but this is one of the ones that I would qualify kind of as an entry level for me. If I was talking to somebody that wasn't sure out of these 5 barrels and they weren't sure which one that they should start with, I would probably recommend this one.
A nice one. You know, I just went back to 5, and I get a compound that I really love in bourbons, and it doesn't always happen, but I get a little bit of a compound called the lactone, which comes across as toasted coconut. And I didn't get it, but it seems that right after tasting number 2 and going to number 5 again, you know, it's sort of you know, you pick up differences when you bounce between them. And one thing that I like to do, I've got a glass of 1792 here just to sort of cleanse my palate, if you will. And tasting our standard 1792 versus these really shows off the differences is in very dramatic fashion.
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to point out to people too, when you're either going through a tasting or sampling single barrel, always go back to that first one that you started with, because, you know, if it's, sometimes we're doing this at 9, 10 o'clock in the morning and your palate's not really warmed up and your mouth's not ready for that, you know, something this big and bold. So if you're going through 5 or 6 samples, you know, take a break, go back to that first one and try it again. You'll be amazed the difference that you see between the first time you sample it and then when you go back.
I find that first sip, you know, bourbon it's a lot of alcohol. And especially if you're getting into barrel proofs, these are relatively mild, but that first sip is always a little hot. And you need a sip to sort of equilibrate your tongue, to get it used to the environment. So I always put a little bit on my tongue and kind of let it rest, and then I'm ready to taste. One other thing that I think is worth mentioning, I'm really a fan of well-made cocktails. And I like bourbon forward cocktails. So, you know, an old fashioned is a classic. It's often my indicator cocktail. If I go to a bar, I want to order an old fashioned, because frankly, it's harder to make an old fashioned bad than it is good. And, you know, I mean, meaning it needs to be a balance, just a tiny bit of sugar, just a little bit of bitters, and you can break up the bitters, not muddled orange, just an expression of the lemon and or lime peel, excuse me, orange peel. And it's really that simple. But anyways, it's bourbon forward and balance is key. But one thing that I've learned is that with these Thomas S. More bourbons, some of them, the sherry and the Cabernet in particular, make incredible Manhattans, which is simply bourbon and a little bit of vermouth. And the wine characters really complement the vermouth. And it makes an incredible Manhattan. So I recommend that for people who like Manhattans as well.
So Danny, Mark recommends bottle number 2 for
Okay.
somebody who's looking to enter the bourbon drinking category. But which of these 5 would you suggest? Are you on the same page, number 2, or would you pick a different one?
I think 2 is a great choice. I find the one reason why, and again, by the way, when we talk about preferences, you know, people are not right or wrong, you know, so if I disagree, it doesn't mean that Mark is wrong. And I'm pretty sure he would also probably agree that it doesn't mean that I am wrong. So preference is not about right or wrong. But one thing that I will tell you in my field of work, people can be wrong. Because we are tasting often looking for specific off notes. And if somebody doesn't know how to detect that off note, they miss it, then they are wrong. You know, there's, you know, certain compounds that we don't want in our bourbon. And if we train people to pick that out, they don't pick it out and they miss it. In that case, they're wrong, but that's not a preference. So that being said, I do think that from a aroma and body standpoint, 2 is a good choice. I'm finding it to be a little bit too oaky, and people might so it leaves a little bit of a drying flavor that might be too much for some people. If you don't like oak, you know, for example, I love some Chardonnay wines, but I often find that a lot of Chardonnay wines are just overly oaked. I don't know if that's still the case because I don't drink wine as much as I used to, but that's an example of, you know, I just find oak to be, it takes over, it dominates. So anyway, so let me sniff a couple others real quick. I find 3 to be really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it's very dark. I find 3 to be kind of mild. I find it to be fairly full, a little bit sort of soft. And it does not have a harsh finish. So to me, for entry-level bourbons, I will often rely more heavily on how it finishes, because, you know, if it's really alcoholic and hot, it's going to burn, and that is going to detract from people wanting to take another sip. So number 3 to me, it's interesting. It's really dark, and that might have something to do with the sherry that was in there. I don't find it overly oaky. I certainly get some oak, some fruit. I get a lot of I actually get a lot of fruit and some caramel. So right now, I think 3 might be the best entry level choice. Let me try 4. 4 is a little hotter, a little sharper. I think right now I would probably put 3 as the #1 entry level bourbon. And again, it's preference. What do you like? What do you not like? So that's my decision on the spot.
Awesome. And guys, like Mark mentioned, get a couple bottles to see what you do like. If you are just entering the bourbon category, pick up #2 and #3. See which one you like better. Or #5, because that apparently is the winner with our attendees tonight.
And I try to stay objective, but when people talk about something, even in my profession, if somebody says, wow, this sample is XYZ, we try not to comment when we're tasting, because whether I try to ignore it or not, by presenting something like that, there's a very strong bias, and you can convince people that that's what it is, even if it is not. And I'm not immune to that either. Somebody says, oh my goodness, this is very cinnamony. I might, the power of suggestion is powerful. So it's good to it's good to be aware of that. But again, right now, so #5 was talked about a lot, but right now I'm also a fan of #5. I'm just getting more aroma and complexity and flavor than the others, and that's what I'm preferring right now.
It's funny, Danny, you mentioned the word cinnamon for my tasting note at #4. That was one of the hints that I had in my background was cinnamon. So it's funny that you just mentioned that, but that was on my.
And cinnamon's an interesting flavor. From my experience, the majority, cinnamon can come from the barrel. We often refer to it as baking spices, but certain varieties of rye are very, very cinnamony. We use a blend of 4 different ryes, and they tend to err on the peppery, nutty side, and that's where most ryes are. But some ryes are intense cinnamon. I mean, like fireball level cinnamon, no joke. Some single varietal ryes I've had are so intense in cinnamon that it's almost like, not quite like fireball, but it's pretty crazy. And maybe that's what's going on here. I don't know.
Danny, I have a few more questions for you.
Of course.
So we have Mark Roy here on Zoom, but we have another Mark watching on Facebook, and he would like to know if the secondary barrel finishing counts towards the age statement.
So, well, let me think about that. I honestly don't have an answer. Now, a couple things. One, we are not age dating these. #2, bourbon dated, it has to be the very youngest bourbon that's in there is what you have to state the age at. And so for clarity, we're putting bourbon that's 5 to 6 years old in the barrel, and then it ages for another 2 to 4 years. So that would be then 6 + 4 in the most extreme case. But I'm gonna guess, and I honestly don't know the answer to this, but I'm gonna guess that I don't know. It's interesting. If we were to age date it, it would probably have to be based on bourbon age. But because remember, these are technically not bourbons. They are bourbon that are they're in the specially finished category. And Chris might be able to add something to that. But they're bourbons that were finished in a barrel. So we can't just call them bourbons. We have to specify that they were finished in a secondary container.
Yeah, Danny, just to add to that, they do fall under the distilled spirit specialty category per the TTB. Yeah. And I'm not sure about age requirements, but I would think that it would have to be the original bourbon age if we were to age date these, but they won't be age dated, as Danny mentioned. We're really going after the flavor profile. And most of this whiskey that you end up tasting tends to be on the mid to older side anyway.
And on that note, to add to that, when the final blend for the Chardonnay, for example, was created, we had barrels that were aged in the Chardonnay casks for 2 years and some that were for 5 years. So if we were to age, and that blend was created based on taste alone, it wasn't based on age. So in that case, we could only claim, the youngest 2 years, because it cannot represent an average. It has to represent the youngest bourbon that's in that bottle for a bourbon. But I don't think that's a thing with these, the age statement. Interesting question. I have to follow up on that.
Awesome. And then we've got some chatter going on in the Zoom chat. People want to know about barrel number 1.
So barrel number 1 is the darkest by far. Now, again, you probably don't have all 5 side by side, but barrel number 1 is crazy dark. And I'm guessing that it might maybe because of the sherry that was aged in that one. It might maybe had a little more residual sherry, maybe the toast level. But I get a lot of complexity. I get, plenty of caramel. I almost get what I'm considering to be a little bit of a roasted coffee, which is really interesting. Clearly it's sherry. I find this one to be pretty full. I get a little bit of a sort of toasted oak dryness, astringency, which is not a negative. It just means that the flavor lasts for a while. So I'm getting a lot of oak note. And I think it's pretty approachable and sort of soft. When I say soft, meaning doesn't have any really sharp, high alcohol peaks. It's just sort of full and lasting. I think it's also a good entry level one, but it's got a lot of flavor and I think it's very approachable.
Danny, you don't happen to have one of the bottles there next to you, do you? One of the single barrel bottles?
No, I've just got the little sample bottles.
Okay, I'm gonna actually step out. I have a couple people on Facebook asking me to see the bottle and I have one upstairs, so I will be right back.
Good.
All right, guys, no questions for Mark while he's gone. We did have a great question come through that Chris has already answered, but for those of you who can't see the chat, I just want to call attention to this. So Eric here on Zoom wanted to know if other states were getting these bottles. And so these specific sherry cask finishes are at 86 proof are only available here in New Hampshire. So these are really special. I'm going to give Mark some kudos while he's off screen, but he did a great job working with Danny and Chris, bringing these here to New Hampshire. Something really special that you can get right now at most of our stores. Most of these bottles have been available since the 15th, 16th of April. We've seen a really good response. For those of you who know Shannon from other live events, her and I, we keep an eye on the Commission's Facebook page, and we've had a lot of great feedback from people. So, pick them up while you can.
And I made a huge mistake, and maybe I shouldn't share this for the people in New Hampshire, but I probably should have taken a bottle of each one for our library, and I did not do that. Or honestly, I should have taken a couple cases, but that would have been probably too much. But from a library standpoint, one of the things I'm developing is our Bourbon Library, so that when I hand the reins off in 10 years, there's a collection of lots and lots of historic bourbons, because I think that's really good to have and important to note. But I made a big mistake by not taking a couple of these off the line. Now our quality lab probably has some, but they're probably not totally intact. So shame on me. Oh well.
Danny, I will make sure that you get one of each bottle, and I will personally make sure they get shipped down to you for your library.
Thank you. And again, I really truly believe that's important, because over the years, if we collect a sample of everything we do, I think that becomes, honestly, historically important. And if we want to evaluate flavor, hey, how did this compare to something we did 15 years ago? Luckily, bourbon is pretty stable, so the flavor will not change radically.
All right, Mark, now that you're back, we were talking about you the whole time you were gone, but now that you're back, let's see that bottle.
My ears were ringing the whole time, so can you see that?
Oh, yeah.
So tall, thin bottle, the New Hampshire sticker here with the barrel number located right there. If you talk to any of our store personnel, they'll be able to tell you the barrel number itself is actually tied to the code number on the back, so they can easily tell which barrel number if you're looking for a particular barrel number. There also should be some POS in the stores with some of my tasting notes on there. It's just like Danny said earlier, everybody's palate's different and your tasting notes are different, but just to give you a general idea of, what I might have thought was an entry level or more bigger and bolder, but those are the bottles and they're out there in select stores. So go out and grab some.
And there's the Bell of Nelson to point out to people, the horse at the top. And that is, again, Chris probably has more information, but that I believe is the exact drawing that came from some of the bottles in the late 1800s.
Yeah, it's an exact reimagining of that drawing from his Bell of Nelson brand, which Danny mentioned at timely, being this is Derby week, that it was a Kentucky Oaks winner.
Well, that's right. It is Derby week. Yeah. And they, by the way, they are really gorgeous bottles. It was hard to see there because there's a little light, but if you look online, it's really incredible. I'm not the packaging guy, I don't think I do very well at that, but I recognize really cool packaging and they did a great job. I think it's gorgeous.
So if anybody is looking for the store nearest them that has these 5 bottles, go ahead and drop a note in the Zoom chat or on Facebook. Let me know what is your preference. I can take a look at the inventory for you. So don't hesitate to reach out. We want to make sure you get your product that you're looking for. All right. You guys, we've got a question. I'm not sure if this is going to be a Mark or a Danny question, but Terry here on Zoom is curious, what is the next release and when will it be hitting the stores?
Well, there's probably 2 ways to answer that. One is not New Hampshire specific, because as I think you pointed out, there's going to be one release every year, leading up to a more ceremonial event. And so there's that release coming. And I think, Chris, that's a Merlot. Is that correct?
I believe that's the plan for this fall, yes.
Okay. And then, of course, there's the regular Thomas S. More that's not single barrel. That is going to be 3 or 4, and we're sort of selecting those now. It's probably going to be sherry. There's probably going to be a cognac and a Merlot and a Madeira. Those are kind of the ones we're looking at. So that's kind of what we're planning on. But we also have to go through the final evaluation process and just make sure they're where we think they are. But that's the plan.
Yeah, I did that too, Danny. This is going to be a once-a-year release each year with different types of cask finishes. And Danny mentioned earlier, we have a ton of different experiments. So what you had this year with port, Chardonnay, and Cabernet Sauvignon may come back. They might not come back. So each year, just be on the lookout for unique cask finishes. They're all going to be extended cask finish, different types of casks, spirits, and wine from around the world. So lots of exciting things to come.
Have we talked about all the bottles already? Did we skip number 4? I feel like we might have.
Oh, well, we might have. I know I tasted it, but I might not have said anything about it. So,
We were letting our viewers guide us through. We didn't go 1 through 5. We were kind of all over the place. So we let them lead the way tonight.
Yeah, is anybody tasting bottle number 4 tonight? Or I keep calling it bottle 4, barrel 4.
Yeah, we understood you, so that's quite all right. So I am tasting barrel and bottle number 4 right now. It's got an incredible nose, classic sherry, some really interesting nuttiness and some great again stone fruit character. It's got a lot of age. I think the dominant flavor, there's a lot of toasted oak notes. I think that, oak's not the only thing going on here, but I think that if I were to pinpoint one flavor, it would be oak. And, sometimes oak can be too smoky or kind of burnt. This is just, it's really nice. It's not the oak you get from, the one gets from a bourbon barrel, but it's more of a toasted character. So, kind of baking spices. And again, I often don't specify into individual spices like clove or nutmeg, but just kind of baking spices. And I get a little bit of that toasted coconut here, which is also an oak note. So I guess I would say that the secondary cask oak character really dominates this one, where it's the predominant character. Maybe dominates too strong of a word. Remember when I talked about these, the flavors are the original bourbon that went into it, and I like a younger bourbon to get the grain bills and the fermentation character, not too much char oak. And then the flavor of the cask it was in, so sherry flavors. And then it was the extended aging, more aging, more oxidation, more changes. But then again, this one dominates on the toasted character of the barrel. So I get a lot of toasted oak notes that probably came from the sherry cask specifically. And that's why, it's really great. I mean, I'm not saying this to sell, because unfortunately, I think there's probably way more demand than there's supply of any of these. I think that's the case, but they're all very different. And again, this one really is a great example of the oaky notes that come from the cask, the secondary cask it was stored in. Mark, what are your comments on this based on your selection?
You actually hit some of the ones that I said. I had baking spice written down in my notes. I thought the end on this, the finish on this one, I had a well balanced between sweet and heat, kind of a medium length. It definitely stays around but doesn't linger for a long time. So it's kind of a nice finish and something that doesn't stick with you. But yeah, I had similar to what you did with the baking spices and a little bit of oak, but not too overpowering in the oak.
Nice, yeah.
Just looking at some other questions, it looks like you're going to have a market for the tawny port finish if it's up to par. We've got quite a few people on the line saying that they would like it here in New Hampshire. So
what I'll say about the tawny port is we've got just a couple that are, sort of experimenting with right now. So if we wanted to do a bigger release, we'd probably have to put more in barrels. But, and again, I love putting Chris on the spot, but, here we got, a handful of barrels. What do we do with them? So maybe we only release them in our gift shop. And I don't want to get in trouble here. I don't know what the logistics are, but, when we only have a couple barrels, we're not going to throw them away. So how do we utilize them and get them out there somewhere? It's not fair. I mean, just imagine if I only had 10 barrels of something really special, and we found that it was perfect after 3 years of age. And then I determined that, and then we want to make a whole bunch of this. Well, it's going to be another 3 years. So what do we do with those 10 barrels in the meantime? So that's something we'll figure out.
Yeah, it's a good problem to have, I think. I saw Mark raise his hand. I think he'd be glad to take some of our smaller experimental releases up to New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Danny, we did have one question in the chat about Terry is going to be in Louisville the weekend of Memorial Day and wanted to take a tour. There's 2 listed. Do you have a recommended tour that you would, out of the 2 that are available?
At 1792, Barton.
Yes.
1792. What are the 2 that are available?
I believe it's the estate tour and I can't remember the name of the other tour. I think there's a shorter one and a longer one.
Yeah, the longer one is certainly going to be more complete. And it's going to probably go up to the warehouses and, maybe do some other stuff. Our normal tour is about an hour, and it's, our tours are free and our tour guides are awesome and they understand the process and the history. And, our tour is, it's interesting. I like to describe it as genuine and gritty. We are an old distillery. We are, again, from 1889 and in some of the original facilities there. So we're not some really fancy, shiny copper penny. it's gritty and you get to go into the process. So it's you know, so there's that.
Danny, will
But
you be
anyway,
there?
what's that?
Will you be there? Will Terry get to meet you in real life?
What's the date?
I think he said Memorial Day. Memorial Day weekend.
Well, I will. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't know, and I don't have my full calendar in front of me. But if I am more than happy to say hello, and maybe show you something. Maybe taste some other Thomas Moore's.
I'm so jealous.
So you know, when you sign up for the tour, you know, mention that was stated with our tour folks, and they know who I am, of course. And if I'm there, I'm happy to say hello. But I honestly can't tell from where I sit right now.
That's awesome. I'm so jealous. I can't wait until we can have people back for real tours, not real tours, excuse me, real tastings. Our education room at Store 50, it's so sad seeing it there without, you know, all 5 of these products in it. Tonight would have been a great night at Store 50 in our tasting room. So
yeah, well, hopefully this will pass soon and we can get back to normal, but you know, we're getting there. Like I said, I'm going to be on a plane in a couple of weeks for the first time in 15 months, and I'm comfortable and excited about it.
awesome. Well, Danny, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is actually Danny's second event with us. He did an event a couple weeks ago before the products were even available. So I posted the link to an article about that event on Facebook. I'll also share that tomorrow morning with those who came via Zoom in a thank you email to you guys. So you can read a little bit more about the products, see a picture of all the bottles. Mark's bottle is great, but you want to see them all, see the different color variations. You can always check product availability on our website. You can search liquorandwineoutlets.com for Thomas S. Moore, and all of the cask finished products will show up. And then you can pick your favorite store. These are available pretty much throughout the state, not every store, but pretty high availability. Somebody specifically asked for Londonderry, and actually only one of them is available in Londonderry. I checked, but Salem has them all. So if anybody else was wondering in that area, head to Salem. You can pick out any bottle you want. So if you have any other questions that you think of, if you're watching this as a replay that you want to ask Danny, go ahead and still leave a comment on Facebook, or once this gets up on YouTube, you can leave one there and I'll send it over to him. So Danny, thank you so much for your time tonight, and Chris and Mark, of course. For those of you who are wine lovers, join us tomorrow night. We're going to close out the month with John Williams from Frog's Leap for a live event tomorrow night. And then we'll be back in May with a few more events. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you all soon. And I hope you're enjoying your Thomas S. Moore special edition bottles.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciated being here and the great questions, and you know, how you've set it up. And Mark, again, your input and commentary on the selections, awesome. So I hope everyone gets a chance to try them.
Thank you as well, Danny. We really appreciate you and Chris and the crew down there. You stay well, and we'll hopefully see you guys up here for the Distiller Showcase.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thanks, Mark. Thanks,
Right.
Carol.
Awesome. Good night, everyone.
Cheers, everybody. Good night.
Bye-bye.